Hello, welcome to the Breakthrough Seminar from me, John Latoc. That's me on the right there. I'm a bit of what is termed these days as a hybrid athlete. I've done quite a bit of running in my time, fitness races, high rocks, cycled across Australia, cycled across America, also done more on the strongman side as well, bodybuilding in between. A lot of it has been a journey of discovery for me personally, but to do those things along the way, I've looked at a lot of stuff to do with programming, strength and conditioning, and how to get the most out of whatever challenge I'm doing at the time. And most recently, I have got more into the metabolic side of things. And how can we really understand our metabolism and ultimately energy production in order to get performance gains? So the subheader for this seminar is Metabolic Secrets. It's not really secrets in terms of only a select few know this stuff, but the reality is that a lot of athletes, whether amateur or more at the elite level, don't understand really what the metabolism is all about, what it is doing, what are the key components, and most importantly, how they can use that to optimize what they're doing and optimize their training. We all know a lot of athletes get to a very good level simply through hard work. Hopefully they're working from good programs, obviously a bit of a genetic element as well. But what we're looking to do here is say, how can I break through glass ceilings that are holding me back from the next level? This is going to take more of a performance perspective, but I do work with a lot of people who you would term as Joe Average, looking to improve metabolism because they want to look better and feel better. Obviously, we want maximum energy, minimal body fat, and obviously a decent level of muscle mass. So some things in this seminar are also relevant to those people. It's not like there are people with metabolisms and people without metabolism. So this does apply to everybody at every level. I'm going to talk a bit about science, give you some of the science behind it. I don't claim to be a scientist, and people who have a deeper background in science may well see holes in what I'm going to talk about, but the objective here is to bridge this gap between science and athletes who want to get better. So I'm not going to bamboozle you with things. I'm not going to go too deep into the Krebs cycle and all these kind of things. What I'm looking to do is highlight the key areas that you should be looking at and now can look at with metabolic analysis. So just some somewhat basic things we already know, and you probably already know, is VO2 max is a KPI for any human, especially you as an athlete. I think most of us know that if we have all else equal, if our VO2 max is higher, then we will be a better endurance athlete. Not only that, even on a Joe Average level, we know now that as an indicator of longevity, VO2 max is the best we have right now. So again, all else equal, if you have a higher VO2 max, then you can be expected to live longer. So a pretty important metric. But as I said earlier, on the side of athletic performance, particularly endurance, and we know that if we can increase your VO2 max, you are going to perform better. We also know that FTP is a KPI for cyclists, for instance. We know that if we can get that threshold right, train at that threshold as much as possible within reason, then again we will see performance gains. And finally, we know a bit about lactate thresholds, and they're this crucial sort of cliff edge that you need to understand, because used correctly you can shape your training and see performance gains, but used incorrectly, or if you go over those thresholds, then as you know, if you go over those thresholds in training or in a race, then you rapidly get this drop off, and that the rest of that training session can be a write-off. In a race, you can end up finding yourself dropping off the pace and potentially dropping off the road because you go too hard too soon. So, like I said, a very crucial cliff edge where you want to get as close to the edge as possible but not go too far over. You may have had a lactate test, and you probably know they can almost be a little bit messy. You've got to be sticking a lancet in your earlobe. It can, there can be blood involved. Hopefully, if it's done correctly, not so much, but it is still pretty messy to measure. And what I'm going to show you is a great way to get the same thresholds, but much more simply, and like I say, without trying to pinprick yourself or having somebody else to do it. So we know those things as markers are very, very important for performance gains. But as we said, can be hard to measure. So a lot of people will then say, oh, well, now we just listen to the Garmin gods. I listen to my watch. My watch tells me my lactate threshold. My watch tells me what my VO2 max is. Well, sadly, this is not strictly true. And I have no doubt that these devices, these gadgets are going to get more and more accurate as AI gets involved. It's already involved, but as that progresses. But realistically, right now, they are based on modelling and not analysis. That modelling is largely based on heart rate, which we know can be highly variable. I'm sure you've seen it before, where you're out running and you're thinking, well, I'm running at the same pace here, but my heart rate's 5-10 beats higher. And that can be down to a lot of things, whether it's fatigue or weather, the environment. So again, not as accurate as we'd like things to be. Analysis has obviously been more sort of available to high-level athletes, if you've got access to a sports science lab, but typically you need to be kind of at a very high level, doing a sports science degree, training for the Olympics. It hasn't really been accessible. So that's why these devices can be good. But as I said, they are based on modelling, essentially saying, well, you're running at this speed, your heart rate is this, therefore I predict your lactate threshold is X or Y and your VO2 max is Z. What we're seeing as these things get studied more is that they're fairly useful, very useful really for the average population, but not so much for higher level athletes. We also know that you need to be doing a lot of high intensity work for these VO2 max readings to be more accurate. And again, that might not suit you if you're working through certain phases. If you're working through a base phase where you're not doing huge amounts of high intensity work, then again, what you're getting out of your Garmin is not necessarily going to be particularly useful. A retort to that again might be, well, if the trends are improving, then I know my training's working. Yes, to a point, but again, trends tend to be a bit more useful at a population level. If someone can see that their steps are trending upwards, great. If they're doing more volume each week, then great. If their VO2 max is going up, then great. But for yourself, you might know that, where you need your VO2 max to be to perform at a certain level. If that's not accurate, then you're not really sure where you're at. And I often talk about percentages, like as well as I do, if you're racing, that a 10% sort of difference in performance is absolutely huge. You can lose races on 0.5%, 1%. So if we're getting these typical sort of 5 to 10% data errors out of a Garmin versus proper metabolic analysis, that's going to affect your training, that's going to affect your racing. So it really is a huge thing. And this can be hard to tell people when they've spent, hundreds and hundreds, potentially over £1,000 on gadgets. But like I keep saying, if your objective is better performance, then this is definitely something you need to be looking at. So yes, Garmin's are obviously useful, but we need to take certain parts of it with a pinch of salt, particularly in terms of what it is telling you about how you should be shaping your training. Sadly, at the moment, they don't do a great job of that. They're kind of telling you where you're at, roughly, but not exactly what you need to do to improve things. And that is exactly what we're going to explore in this presentation. So an extension of that is, even if you are doing a VO2 max test, maybe you've done one in a lab somewhere, you've been rigged up to one of these machines, then again, you got to ask yourself, is this testing actually useful, or is it more of an ego thing? And that can work both ways. It can be an ego boost. Well, last time I did this, my VO2 max was 50, now it's 54. So it's a bit of an ego boost. But obviously it can work the other way, where maybe you for whatever reason your VO2 max has dropped. So it's a score, it's a scorecard, but well, what do I do? Why is my VO2 max higher? How do I know what has worked, or why is it lower? How do I know what is going on? What is the problem? So scores are insightful, obviously, but not a huge amount of use when we're wanting accurate data to guide us in our next phase of training. And one thing I've got more and more into is what I call limitation-based training. So we'll often approach a training year, an annual plan, with a guide. Typically, we'll do base work at the start, build up that volume. As we get close to the race, we might sort of drop the volume, increase intensity. A lot of people use those kind of approaches, but again, is that really what we need to be doing? As we're going to find out, if we find there's a limitation in your metabolic pathway, it makes sense to attack that limitation rather than say, well, I know I've got this limitation, but the plan says I need to work on A and B in this phase. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's giving us a new perspective on how we approach our training. So what is the metabolism? We kind of have a rough idea. It's something to do with food and energy production. Again, this could be an entire degree on its own. So me covering it in one slide is certainly not going into the depth it deserves, but for the purpose of what we're trying to achieve today, it's essentially the interplay of your lungs, your heart, and your muscles. We're looking at getting in as much oxygen as we can, obviously through the lungs, supplying it through the lungs to the heart. The heart does its thing and pumps it around the body, the delivery system, as we call it, and eventually it finds its way to the muscles, where we use oxygen to create ATP or energy, and obviously through that conversion we get some carbon dioxide produced, and we're looking to remove that back through the cardiovascular system and then back up into the lungs, and off it goes as we exhale. Okay, so it's from the moment we inhale to using it in the muscles, and then back up to the moment we exhale. So again, we have three sort of key areas: supply, delivery, and usage. And we're now starting to see where the rest of this presentation is going to go in terms of looking at, well, do I have a supply issue? Do I have a delivery issue? Do I have a usage issue? And I don't mean issue as in terms of everything's negative. You could be performing at a very high level, but no matter where you are at, the next stage is going to be limited by something. So again, you could have a very high oxygen intake, very high lung capacity, but maybe the delivery is just not keeping up with that. And we're going to have a look at how we find out all of that in a second. So again, returning back to what we spoke about earlier, if all you're ever doing is looking at VO2 max, it's kind of like if you imagine a factory, all you're really looking at is the factory output. What I want you to look at is, okay, well, is the supply chain working properly? Are we getting the maximum amount of vans to deliver maximum amount of supplies? If not, then we need to look at it. How is the delivery system? Like, once stuff is kind of getting into the warehouse, is it being delivered to the right areas in the factory? Is it being delivered efficiently, or is there a problem with the workers in that respect? And then again, we come down to usage. So everything that's been delivered, are we utilising it properly? Are the people at the sort of final stage of production, are their work processes effective? Are they using what we're giving them in terms of resources? So when you start to think about it as a warehouse that's receiving and utilising, or a factory utilising what's being delivered and what's being supplied, we start to realise that, okay, we can look at individual elements of this and improve those. But obviously we have to have a way of testing that. Okay, and even knowing your thresholds, for instance, like if you do lactate testing, again, it's telling you what is happening. It's not telling you why that is happening. Okay, and why they're not higher than they are right now. So let's have a look at our own sort of factory and what is going on. So we've spoken about the lungs. So what do we need to know about the lungs? Well, we need to know your forced vital capacity, shortened to FVC. That is effectively how much air you can hold in your lungs. Again, if we can increase that, then obviously we can be putting more oxygen into the system at the very start. We need to know forced expiratory volume, what is known as FEV1, or essentially how much you can exhale in the first second. So we would really think about that as lung power versus lung volume. Combining those, we want to know your ratio of FEV1 to FVC. We know that if things are working well, then in a spirometer test, we should be reaching 70% or more. So you should be able to exhale in 1 second 70% plus of your FVC. And if you're not, then we know that there is a sort of lung power or a lung capability issue. So as I said, all of this is done with a simple spirometer test. You may have seen these if you've ever had sort of asthmatic problems or been at the doctor and they wanted to check your breathing. You may well have done this. You're holding what looks like almost like a small mobile phone with a piece of cardboard sticking out, a full inhale, a sharp and full exhale, and then a full inhale. And that will give us these readings. We can obviously compare against yourself as time goes on, but we can also compare these readings against what would be expected of someone of your age and height and gender and so on. So again, we've already got these markers and we can say, well, this isn't where we would predict it to be, so we need to deal with this. In terms of lungs, not shown on a spirometer test, but shown on a good metabolic analysis, we want to look at breathing frequency, also known as breathing coordination at each intensity zone. So you may well breathe well as you go through zone 1, zone 2, but as you get to higher levels, you're unable to coordinate your breathing. Maybe it's very jerky, almost panicky. So again, we will want to look at improving that coordination, and there's ways we can do that specifically with breath training. And that's not, it doesn't matter how many times you bang your head on a brick wall, training harder, trying to train faster. You need to train that coordination properly to see a performance gain from that. We're looking at the heart, so we start going down the system. You know what your max heart rate is, or you know what maximum heart rate is. Not something we can really change an awful lot, but it does give us a clue as to whether we are reaching the right levels in training. Or we just simply unable to get there? We can obviously use it for heart rate training zones, but as I'm going to show you later, I want to give you a different way of looking and shaping your training, because as we said earlier, heart rate can be very variable. So using heart rate zones in your training, does it make sense? You know, depending on time of the year, if you're training somewhere else, if you're racing somewhere else, that can almost be false accuracy at times. But looking at this graphic here, you know, things I will be looking at is it a steady trend to get from your warm-up pace up to that sort of that VO2 max level. So even on this one, you know, this is from an actual test, we can see that there's a nice steady increase, a bit of a jump as we sort of move into that would be around zone 3. But looking up at the top there, when we put it up against VO2, we see that VO2 was still wanting to increase, whereas the heart rate did start to kind of level off and didn't increase at the same rate as it did earlier on. So immediately we can see that this person probably doesn't spend a lot of time training at or slightly above threshold. Maybe they haven't done a lot of VO2 max training. Okay, so already we're looking at clues, and this is what this is all about. It's almost like a crime scene. Let's gather all the information we can and then look for clues about where the crime is being committed. Not everybody is the same. It's all about personalizing around your metabolism. So that's sort of some brief things we want to know about heart performance. And then down at a muscular level, we're looking at things like how are the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide changing, both important. This is what it's all about. It's gaseous exchange. This is how a metabolic analysis mask works. It's basing all of our data on gaseous exchange combined with heart rate, and we'll also talk about a MOXIE monitor. So what we're looking at here is exposing clear indicators of metabolic thresholds, and it's not like one graph will just tell us everything. We are looking at a variety of graphs which we're going to explore in a second. But even just on this graph here, we can see the purple line there, essentially how much of the breath that you're exhaling is oxygen. So as that starts to creep up, then we know that you're probably reaching that sort of top threshold where you're not utilizing as much oxygen as you were earlier. So that's where we start to see this sort of peripheral limitation where the oxygen is going in, but the muscles are not using everything that they're being supplied with. Okay, so something's falling off at that stage. So we're starting to get into this idea of break points, of where not break point as is it's breaking down, but the graph breaks, the trends break, and that tells us very accurately when you're reaching these metabolic thresholds. So one way of looking at thresholds is ventilatory threshold. So this is the ventilation graph that we get thrown out, and some things to the naked eye might not even look particularly clear, but what I am looking at is obviously first of all VT1, so ventilatory threshold 1. If you look at the light blue graph, that is your breathing frequency. So yes, obviously we get these jagged moments, but as a trend you will see that pretty much between around 7 minutes and sort of 15 minutes, about 13 minutes on the test, it was fairly level. There was no great increase in breathing frequency, so this person was pretty comfortable. Similarly, if we look at the litres per minute ventilation graph, that dark green graph, again we see not a huge increase in ventilation. This person's body was happy with what was being supplied until we get to that red line. So that was around the sort of 13.5 minute marker. We start to see that breathing frequency trending upwards. We start to see ventilation trending upwards. So we know this person has reached that first ventilatory threshold, and things start to increase from there. As we go through the gears, as we're increasing, you can see what looks like the pyramid there, the step effect. Basically every minute we're increasing by 0.5 kilometre an hour. So we get a clear idea as we go through the gears what is happening. So then around that sort of 20.5 minutes, again we start to see a second sharp increase in ventilation. We see the breathing frequency go through another sharper increase. So it gives us a clue that we are now at that ventilatory threshold 2, or what most people think of as their sort of anaerobic threshold. So does that tell us everything we need to know? Well, not really. We want to sort of gather a little bit more information and see what is going on. So again, when we look at the muscle oxygen saturation, this is something that a lot of people have not experienced, have not been able to test, but possibly the most important thing. This is what we're really looking at. Like I said, heart rates and so on are variable. What we want to know is, when does muscle tissue saturation change? That will tell us really exactly what is happening in the sort of energy production at a cellular level, at a muscular level, and those are the points that we want to be really interested in, that sort of break point 1 and break point 2. So again, using this person here, we can see that when we look at the purple line, that is tissue saturation. We can see that, yes, there's a slight downward trend, but again, we're still at a fairly high level of oxygen saturation, and it does start to sort of level off a little bit, but then when we hit where that green line is drawn, we start to experience a downhill trend all the way. We can also look at the red line is hemoglobin difference, so oxygenated hemoglobin, deoxygenated hemoglobin. We can see it starts to sort of reach a peak there as well. So again, another clue to put together with the other graphs we're looking at. And so both of those now start to go on a downward trend as we go through what you would know as sort of heart rate zone 3 and zone 4. And then when we get to that where the second green line is drawn, we see that this person, their oxygen saturation basically starts to level out. So we know that they're basically unable to push anymore, unable to process any more oxygen than that. However, some people will experience another sharp decline, but ultimately in this person it is leveling out. So again, we know that they are reaching or have reached that threshold, or what I prefer to refer to as breakpoint 2. So if you wanted to refer back to the previous slide, you will see that those lines magically occur at the same point, sort of around from memory, I think it was about 13 minutes 20, and around the sort of getting close to 21 minutes. But ultimately that gives us confirmation of these 2 breakpoints. So I've covered some of this already, but just give you a bit more detail about breakpoints. Breakpoint 1 is typically what we refer to as aerobic threshold, where we move from sort of aerobic energy production to more of a mixed production. We start to use up a bit more in the way of glucose for energy. Lactate begins to accumulate, becoming a secondary energy system. It's where SMO2 really begins to fall, that muscle oxygen begins to fall. In terms of heart rates, it is obviously close to top of zone 2 in terms of the heart rate zones that you already know. And this is really where we want to train for improved aerobic efficiency. So we don't want to be much below this, and we don't want to be going over it. We're trying to train just below it to get increases in mitochondria, the sort of the cellular powerhouses where energy is produced. The more of those we've got, the more energy we can produce. We get increased capillarization, so more capillaries, more delivery and extraction, and ultimately it enables us to do the same work with less oxygen, or to do more work with the same oxygen. That's essentially what aerobic efficiency is, and we know that obviously that is very important for endurance athletes. So moving on to breakpoint 2, typically what we refer to as the anaerobic threshold. Really, there's no such thing. Like, there's no point where you're not using oxygen, but we tend to talk about aerobic and anaerobic, but it's more of a what's dominant and not so dominant. This is where work becomes unsustainable. So we can certainly do work here, but again, everybody's different in terms of how long they can stay there, but it's not something you're going to be doing for, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, definitely not for your longer races. All right, so that is anaerobic threshold, where we get a very high level of lactate accumulation. It's where the secondary energy system is kind of at its limit. And let me just say here, a lot of people have this idea that it's when they get this burn, it's the lactic acid making them burn. It's not really. We know now it's more to do really with hydrogen ions and so forth, but again, not to get into that. But and actually, the lactic acid is part of an energy cycle. It is actually sort of recycled for energy. But yeah, like we say, at this point, it's where we're unable to utilise that properly, so that there is more of an accumulation if you were measuring it. It's where we said SMO2 tends to plateau at a minimum or suddenly declines significantly. In terms of heart rate zones, close to the top of zone 4, usually sort of just above FTP, and may be referred to as ventilatory threshold 2 or lactate threshold 2. So we want to train here for sort of improved lactate usage or clearance, and just generally tolerating higher levels of stress. So the further you are from these breakpoints, the more sort of percentage points you're going to be losing in your training, or you just won't be able to kind of sustain optimal volume. You know, we see people who, if I give you an interval session and I say, right, I want you training here, I have no doubt you could probably do some intervals at a slightly higher level, but what will happen is you will soon drop off. You might do the first 2 or 3 above where you've been asked to train, but then because of all these clearance issues and sort of recycling issues in the energy system, then you will find interval 4, 5, 6 starting to drop off and now well below where we needed you. What we're looking at is every interval is exactly where we need you to stress the body enough to get an adaptation, but we don't need to be sort of proving ourselves with proper top end zone 5 every time. What we want is, like we said, maximum exposure to the required level. Okay, and it also obviously increases recovery time and so on. So if you're looking to be increasing training frequency, then we've got to be careful not to go over that threshold too often. Okay, and similarly going back to breakpoint 1, obviously we want to be spending as much volume as we can at or just below that point, so we get those aerobic efficiency adaptations. All right, so as well as identifying those points, a key thing I've been trying to drop in along the way is that we're asking why is this happening? Why am I at this level and why am I not higher? How can I move higher? So as we're doing these tests, we're looking, or when we're analysing the test, we're looking at, is it a supply question? Is it a capacity question? So we're looking at, like we said, the volume of oxygen that is being supplied, and if that is lower than we want it to be, then we need to be looking at doing specific breath volume work. You know, a lot of people talk about breath work. It's like saying I need to do fitness work. It's like, okay, well, what type of fitness work? You know, it's an all-encompassing term, but until you understand this stuff, you don't really know if you're even doing the right sort of breath work. Is it a capability issue? So there's no problem with capacity. You might have a good lung capacity, but your capability in delivering the oxygen and utilising it is not so good. So maybe we need to look at breath coordination work, and we can see where any breakdown occurs and where we need to train. Or is it expiration power? You just, a bit like muscles, you might have muscles, but they're not as powerful as they could be. So this is where, you know, I use an isocapnic device, basically a breathing bag with a metronome app that kind of goes with it. So you train yourself to breathe hard at the right rhythm, and that's what we mean by coordination. And this stuff's great between kind of what you might think of as proper training sessions, like you're getting on the bike, going out running, because we can be getting an adaptation, we can be training the lungs and getting a training effect, but we're not getting the sort of metabolic build-up that we get with, say, another threshold session. We're giving the joints a rest from going out and doing another sort of 90-minute run. So if you're a bit like me, sometimes you get the guilt of not training, then doing this sort of stuff is fantastic. So you are still training, you are still getting an adaptation, but you are also getting necessary recovery. So do we determine it to be a delivery issue? We said, is your heart rate tracking oxygen delivery? Is there early heavy breathing and fast breathing? Typical in detrained people, you know, their heart's just not used to doing anything really. As soon as it's asked to do something, it's boom, 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 the heart rate flies up, the breathing rate flies up. But it's also common in people who are very much HIIT fanatics. All they do is intervals because they've heard intervals burn more fat or whatever. They get more of that high from feeling like they're absolutely shattered. Also seen in people who typically do a lot of CrossFit stuff and don't do a lot of lower intensity work. So that's something I've seen in a few people. And we can get this sort of almost like an early anaerobic shift, and then they tend to settle down. So again, we can see this as the test goes on. Maybe we need to do more low intensity volume, so just below that BP1. And even outside the gym, maybe we need to look at more parasympathetic behaviours. If they're a person who's a bit of a sort of type 1 personality, very adrenaline based, always kind of wired and fired up, ready to go, then this person might benefit more from deep breathing, box breathing, stress management, so looking more at sort of lifestyle behaviours. Again, we see how this is a much bigger jigsaw than simply get on the bike, do a long ride or intervals. There's so much more to this metabolic jigsaw. And now we've got a way of looking at usage. So we might be saying, well, yeah, oxygen is good, my capacity is good, my supply chain is good, my heart rate is trending nicely, I'm delivering that oxygen to my muscles. But we find out that actually it's more of a peripheral limitation. So a good sign of this is if for instance, the maximum heart rate you've ever achieved is, or achieved recently, I should say, is say 190, but you're not reaching it during this metabolic test, then we know that it's probably more of a peripheral limitation, that simply your muscles can't deal with this this sort of intensity at the top end, but your heart could have actually gone a bit further. So again, more clues. So we might do more training below BP1. The reason being that maybe we need more mitochondria, we need more capillarization at the muscular level. It would be tempting to think, well, actually I need to train harder. Actually, you might need to do more of the lower level stuff to get this physiological adaptation. But then you might also need to do more training above BP2. So we're getting used to rapid oxygen depletion in those muscles. If they're not used to doing that, then we need to train there. So it might help you more as a visual to think of zone 2 work and zone 5 work, if you're used to sort of heart rate zones. And we might even need more strength training. Again, that can help with that sort of oxygen delivery, and even just simply strength to maintain higher speeds, whether it be running or cycling or rowing. So how do we do that? Well, you can see Jamie here with the gas analyzer on, but also if you look into the right hand picture there, you see the infrared sensor, which is what we call the MOXIE monitor, muscle oxygen sensor, monitoring exactly what's going on at the muscular level. And what you don't see in the picture is he's got a heart rate strap on as well. So we've got the gas being analysed, we've got the heart being analysed, and we've got the muscle being analysed all at once. Okay, so we do a resting test to see what that sort of base metabolism is doing, and also we do this graded exercise test, which it depends really how fit you are, but most people will be done in half an hour, and we typically sort of finish at about just above 5k pace, or just above FTP. So this is how we look at this complete metabolic jigsaw. We'll also do a body composition scan. We've got an in-body scanner, which will be looking at obviously muscle mass, body fat percentage. We can even see if there's any discrepancies in muscular distribution. We'll be looking at visceral fat, waist to hip ratio, and getting this sort of overall score. So, we'll be able to see then maybe someone just has a very low muscle mass. If they've done loads and loads of endurance work, then actually sometimes just adding a little bit of muscle, obviously not too much, becoming a bodybuilder is not going to help, but that can be something of a breakthrough. it can give us a clue. Maybe you're what I affectionately call fit fat. Maybe you're holding a bit too much body fat. You've got good fitness levels, high VO2 max, but sorting your nutrition out, get your body fat down, then essentially you're carrying less around. And that can actually improve your VO2 max score, because if you're sort of pumping the same level of oxygen around, but your body mass in terms of kilos is lower, then that's what your VO2 max calculation is. It's kind of oxygen moved per minute per kilo of body weight. So if you want to see a higher VO2 max score, dropping a few kilos of fat can help that. Then we get you on the spirometer. I explained this earlier in terms of the breath volume and breath power test. Look at resting metabolic rate, and then look at that graded exercise test. So the resting metabolic rate is, everyone enjoys that bit. It's basically lying on your back for 10 minutes. And then obviously the graded exercise test was starting from pretty much a walking pace and taking most people to a 5k pace plus about 1 kilometre an hour. That's normally where we top out. And if you want to do it as a cycling test, starting at sort of 100 watts and generally up to about FTP plus 10%, that will be just about right. So you will get these reports. That's your in-body report there on the left, the body composition stuff. And we can see the graded exercise test report with your VO2 max, your maximum heart rate, tidal volume. Nice scores to see, but ultimately what we're looking at more is the training zones, and in particular that sort of VT1, VT2. This will be produced automatically, but then I will have a look at the graphs. Sometimes the AI doesn't pick it up perfectly accurately, so we'll be looking into the graphs to sort of come out with those two speeds. That's really what we want. So you can see here for this person it's 10.2 and 13.7 in terms of breakpoint 1 and breakpoint 2. You're also going to get useful things like the calorie output per hour at different levels. So if you want to be working out accurate nutrition, then that's going to be very useful as well. So stuff that you will kind of get this with your reports, but you don't necessarily need to pay much attention to it. And this is the stuff I will be looking at, which I sort of detail to you a bit along the way. So that's sort of minute by minute change and sort of what is going on. And then what I do for you is essentially mark your homework and give you a scorecard or a report card. So all the things that I've just mentioned there, the body composition, resting metabolic test, respiratory performance, cardio performance, and muscle oxidation performance. We're looking at where things should be, where you were, and then kind of giving you a grade. Obviously, we want the more A's, the better. If you're scoring an A, it doesn't mean you can't improve that, but it's not something you need to keep hammering. What we're looking to find is the C grades in particular. Those are going to be your big breakthroughs. If we can improve those C grades, then your metabolic performance is going to improve. And obviously B somewhere in between. We're basically saying you got a good score, but there's room for improvement. So let's attack the C's. If we can improve the B's at the same time, then when you come and retest, you might have improved everything, and then we still say, right, let's still keep attacking these C's. Or maybe things change. We go, all right, well, actually, that's now at a B level. What else is now at a C level what else can we sort of improve and attack? So, as you can see, it is very much about personalizing things and creating a limitation-based training approach, very much dedicated to you and what you need. It's not to say other planning doesn't work. Clearly, a lot of people reach a very good level doing that, but as I said, this is all about breakthroughs and how can I get those extra percentages that make such a difference. So that is the Breakthrough Seminar. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I've given you some useful insights into what we're looking at and why we're looking at it. And yeah, we're looking to uncover your personal metabolic secrets for performance gains. I haven't gone into too much detail on the science, so I appreciate some people will say, oh, there's a bit more to it than that. I'm aware of that. but for the average person who just wants to perform well and see gains and get on with things, hopefully that has given you the insight you need. And if you'd like to book in for a test, like I said, cycling, rowing, running, we can do it all, personalise it to you, then please get in touch. That's me, John the Top from Stormforce Performance, and hopefully I'll see you in the gym soon.